A flight attendant demands a black woman leave first class. Then she flashes her FAA director badge. Have you ever witnessed a moment so shockingly unjust that the entire world seems to stop for one breathless second? Picture this: a bustling first-class cabin, a poised black woman quietly settling into her seat, and a flight attendant whose single-minded quest for power blinds her to the real power sitting right under her nose. This story unravels at 35,000 feet, where prejudice collides with hidden authority in the most dramatic of fashions. Brace yourself for twists, confrontations, and an unexpected flash of credentials that send shock waves through the cabin. Buckle up. This flight is about to change more than one destiny. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon when Flight 6721 from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, bound for Los Angeles, prepared for boarding. The bustling hub of Atlanta had long been heralded as the world's busiest airport, a place where millions of stories converged, overlapped, and then went their separate ways. The departure lounge was alive with the usual symphony of business people clutching briefcases, families towing restless toddlers, and vacationers giddy with the promise of new adventures. Among the early boarders was Eleanor Vance, a tall, elegant black woman clad in a tailored navy pantsuit. Her regal posture suggested self-confidence, but there was a gentle warmth in her eyes whenever she exchanged a friendly smile or soft greeting with fellow passengers. Few around her would have guessed the magnitude of her position or the respect she commanded within one of the most revered organizations in the aviation world, the Federal Aviation Administration. Settling into her plush first-class seat, Eleanor exhaled a tired sigh. She had spent the last 3 days buried in high-level meetings, drafting regulatory frameworks for improved safety measures on domestic flights. Her work was both demanding and urgent, but Eleanor relished every chance to uphold the highest standards in aviation. Little did she know her passion for fairness and the rule of law would be tested in a far more personal way before this flight even touched down in Los Angeles. In the first-class cabin, a handful of other passengers also settled into their seats. A well-dressed older couple chatted softly about their upcoming Alaskan cruise. A tech entrepreneur paced the aisle, murmuring last-minute instructions to someone on the other end of a Bluetooth call. Meanwhile, Eleanor perused the in-flight magazine, absently turning pages filled with advertisements for exotic vacations and technological gadgets. Moments later, a flight attendant appeared at the front of the first-class cabin. Her name tag read Priscilla Hayes, and her pressed uniform and meticulously pinned hair exuded the polished efficiency one would expect from a senior flight attendant with years of experience. Yet there was an unmistakable edge to her demeanor, sharp eyes scanning the cabin with the readiness of someone expecting trouble before any even began. Priscilla's gaze landed on Eleanor, who had just tucked her carry-on bag under the seat. For a fraction of a second, a puzzled frown crossed Priscilla's face. Then, like a mask carefully slipping into place, she adopted a customer service smile as she handed out pre-departure beverages to the other passengers. Strangely, she bypassed Eleanor. Eleanor didn't think much of it at first. She was engrossed in a recent article about new FAA directives, but fate had already begun weaving the threads of an unexpected confrontation, one that would challenge not only Eleanor's role as a passenger, but also the bigger questions of power and prejudice in the skies. Moments before the boarding door closed, Priscilla approached Eleanor's seat with an air of guarded suspicion. "Ma'am," she began, "could I see your boarding pass?" Eleanor looked up from the magazine, slightly surprised. "Of course," she replied calmly, retrieving the pass from her jacket pocket. Handing the slip of paper over, Eleanor watched Priscilla's expression carefully. Initially, the flight attendant's expression was neutral, but soon her brows knitted together as though something about the boarding pass was amiss. "Is there a problem?" Eleanor asked gently. Priscilla pressed her lips tight. "I just want to be sure everything is correct here," she said. After a tense pause, she returned the boarding pass and forced a thin smile. "Everything seems fine. Enjoy your flight, Ms. Vance." With that, she turned on her heel and left. Eleanor's instincts tingled, but she wasn't about to jump to conclusions. Over the years, she had traveled extensively for work and encountered numerous personalities, some friendlier than others. She chose to give Priscilla the benefit of the doubt. But as the cabin doors sealed and the captain's voice came over the intercom with final announcements, a sense of unease hung in the air. And though Eleanor didn't know it yet, her rightful place in that first-class seat was about to be questioned again in a much more public and unsettling manner. The aircraft pulled back from the gate, and the usual safety demonstration followed. Eleanor leaned back, relaxed as the plane taxied onto the runway. Outside the small window, she caught a glimpse of the airport's bustling tarmac. The heavy jets lined up in a queue for takeoff, ground crews waving orange wands in orchestrated precision. It was a sight Eleanor never tired of. It reminded her why she worked so diligently to ensure the skies were safe for everyone. However, Eleanor's appreciation for this moment was short-lived. Shortly after takeoff, the flight attendants began their cabin service, offering drinks and a small snack in first class. Priscilla moved methodically from the front row toward Eleanor's seat. Again, Eleanor watched as she passed her row without a second glance. No beverage, no snack, nothing. Sensing the deliberate omission, the older couple seated across the aisle from Eleanor exchanged perplexed glances, but said nothing. Eleanor herself furrowed her brow. It was highly unusual to skip a passenger during a standard cabin service, especially in first class, where personalized attention was expected. She wondered if there had been a mix-up with the meal orders, but her instincts whispered a darker explanation. Determined not to assume the worst, Eleanor raised a hand politely to get Priscilla's attention. The flight attendant caught sight of her gesture but turned away quickly, pretending not to notice. Eleanor felt a pit forming in her stomach as she realized this wasn't a simple oversight. Something else was at play here. Several minutes passed before Eleanor had another chance to speak with a flight attendant, but this time it was a younger crew member named Lila who walked by. Eleanor gently tapped Lila on the arm. "Excuse me, I haven't received any service," she said softly. "May I get a cup of water, please?" Lila blinked in surprise. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." "Of course." She immediately offered Eleanor a beverage and a warm smile, seeming genuinely apologetic. As Lila poured water into a glass, Priscilla materialized behind her, eyes narrowed. "Lila, I'll handle this," Priscilla said in a clipped tone, placing a hand on the pitcher. Lila shot Eleanor a worried look before stepping aside. "Ma'am," Priscilla began, tilting her chin upward, "I need to verify your ticket once again." She sounded more authoritative this time, as though issuing an order rather than making a polite request. Confusion tugged at Eleanor's features. "I already showed it to you," she replied carefully, pulling out the boarding pass again. "Is there an issue?" Priscilla examined the slip with exaggerated scrutiny. "We've had reports of passengers from the main cabin taking seats in first class without authorization. I'm sure you understand." A prickle of indignation sparked in Eleanor's chest. "I see," she responded calmly. "However, my ticket is valid. This seat is mine." Priscilla's thin smile returned, and the tension in her gaze was palpable. "Yes," she said, "but I'll need to verify it with the gate agent. Excuse me." And with that, she left, leaving Eleanor unsettled and the older couple across the aisle whispering in hushed tones. As Priscilla slipped behind the galley curtain, Eleanor's heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of a deep-seated frustration. She replayed the flight attendant's words in her mind. "We've had reports of passengers from the main cabin taking seats in first class without authorization. Who had reported such a thing? And why was Priscilla so fixated on her?" In the row behind her, the tech entrepreneur who had been on his phone earlier spoke in a hushed tone to his companion. "This is ridiculous," Eleanor heard him say. "I've been on hundreds of flights, and I've never seen someone get grilled like this in first class." Eleanor felt a small surge of validation. She wasn't imagining it. Others saw the unfairness too. But she also felt an undercurrent of anxiety. Could it be that Priscilla simply disliked her on sight? Or, more upsettingly, could it be something to do with Eleanor's race? She'd encountered subtle racism before in different places, a hint of surprise when she walked into boardrooms, a delay in restaurant service, the occasional disparaging comment. Yet every time it happened, she couldn't help but feel that uncomfortable knot in her stomach. Even with all her achievements, she could still be singled out because of her skin color. It was a harsh truth she hoped was receding from the world, but here it was again, brazen and unyielding at 35,000 feet. About 10 minutes later, Priscilla reemerged, posture rigid as though bracing for a clash. She approached Eleanor and announced in a voice loud enough for the nearby seats to hear, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move to a seat in the main cabin." It appears your ticket is not valid for first class. The gasps from nearby passengers were immediate. The older couple exchanged astonished glances, and the tech entrepreneur behind Eleanor momentarily paused his call, eyebrows shooting up. Eleanor, forced to confront the unjust statement head-on, felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. "That's impossible," Eleanor replied firmly. She maintained her composure, her voice even but resolute. "I'm certain my ticket is valid. If you're not sure, you can double-check the passenger manifest." Priscilla's demeanor hardened. "I have checked," she insisted, "and there is no record of you being assigned to this seat. You need to gather your belongings right now." The hush that fell over that section of the cabin was thick with tension. Eleanor sensed the onlookers waiting for her next move. She took a measured breath. Part of her, the professional side that was used to resolving conflicts amicably, wanted to stand up calmly and speak with logic. But the other part, the side that felt decades of injustice welling up, wanted to protest more forcefully. In the end, she chose to stand up for herself. "I will not move," she said, her tone unwavering. "My name is Eleanor Vance. This is my assigned seat. I suggest you check again, or, better yet, bring the gate agent here to confirm." Priscilla's mouth tightened into a grim line. The older couple across the aisle stirred. The woman, who introduced herself as Barbara, leaned over. "We clearly saw her boarding pass. She was here before the cabin filled up," Barbara said, her voice quivering slightly with indignation. "I don't understand why you keep asking her to move." Priscilla's gaze flicked to Barbara, but held no warmth. "I appreciate your input, ma'am, but this is an airline matter. We have it under control." Sensing the escalating confrontation, a few heads popped up from further rows, curiosity piqued. Even Lila, the younger flight attendant, stepped out of the galley to observe, her eyes darting worriedly between Priscilla and Eleanor. Eleanor remained seated, shoulders squared. She refused to yield to intimidation or to let the flight attendant's authoritative posture cow her into compliance. The tension in the cabin was almost tangible. Meanwhile, Priscilla looked torn, as though she was balancing on a knife's edge of protocol and personal bias. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they would encounter mild turbulence soon and advising passengers to remain seated. Priscilla took the phone from the galley and made a brief, whispered call, likely to the head of cabin services or perhaps someone on the ground. Eleanor remained calm, but her pulse hammered. She did not yet want to reveal her position at the FAA. She hoped this could still be resolved quietly, but events were spiraling faster than she anticipated. Another 20 minutes crawled by. The seatbelt sign flickered on due to the mild turbulence the captain had predicted. Yet Priscilla seemed unwilling to wait for a safer moment. She approached Eleanor once more, this time with a resolute finality in her stance. "Ma'am, if you do not comply, I will have no choice but to notify the authorities upon landing. We have a strict policy about occupying the wrong seat." Eleanor felt a flush of anger flash through her. The repeated accusations were not only insulting, but also entirely baseless. She wasn't just a passenger wrongly accused. She was one of the lead architects behind many of the regulations that govern these very flights. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so infuriating. "I've told you, I'm in my assigned seat," Eleanor replied, her composure betraying only the slightest tremor of frustration. "It would be wise to check the passenger manifest carefully, because I can assure you there is a seat assigned to me in first class. If you don't believe me, please scan my boarding pass again or consult with the gate agent directly." Priscilla's eyes glinted with something suspiciously close to hostility. "I have done my checks," she said icily. "Now I'm giving you a final warning." All around them, tension thickened. Lila hovered uncertainly by the galley, clearly uncomfortable with her senior colleague's actions. Barbara and her husband stared in outrage. The tech entrepreneur behind Eleanor was typing furiously on his phone, possibly tweeting about the bizarre situation unfolding mid-flight. The next few minutes were a slow boil of silent stares and whispered conversations. People in adjacent rows shifted awkwardly in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or remain observers. Outside the cabin windows, clouds stretched across the sky, indifferent to the turmoil unfolding within the pressurized metal tube. Eleanor's mind churned with possible approaches. She could press the call button and request to speak to the pilot or the lead cabin supervisor. Or she could wait until landing and let airport authorities sort this out. But then again, she knew that if the situation escalated, it could result in an even bigger scene. especially if Priscilla continued to claim Eleanor was a disruptive passenger who refused to follow instructions. In a post-9/11 world, flight attendants possessed significant discretionary power to remove passengers deemed a security risk. And then there was her professional role, a card she wielded rarely and only when absolutely necessary. Revealing her FAA credentials could resolve this instantly, but she didn't want to brandish her authority just to quell a rude flight attendant. She prided herself on handling issues with tact and patience. Yet the mounting hostility left her little choice. If she did nothing, she risked a humiliating and public conflict that might overshadow everything she stood for. In that moment, Eleanor decided to give Priscilla one final opportunity to rectify her approach. If the flight attendant persisted, Eleanor would have no qualms about revealing who she really was. In the adjacent aisle, Barbara and her husband whispered words of solidarity to Eleanor. "We're with you," Barbara said softly, craning her neck to meet Eleanor's eyes. "If she tries to force you out, we'll speak on your behalf." Eleanor offered them a small, grateful smile. At least she wasn't entirely alone in this. Her eyes flicked to Lila, who seemed torn between her loyalty to Priscilla and her sense of fairness. Lila gave Eleanor a faint nod, as though silently conveying an apology for her senior's behavior. Just then, a jolt of turbulence rocked the plane. Passengers gasped and clutched their armrests as the aircraft shuddered. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calmly instructing everyone to remain seated with seat belts fastened. Priscilla temporarily paused her pursuit, going through the aisles to ensure seat belts were secured. When she reached Eleanor's row, she took one long, hard look at Eleanor before moving on. The short burst of turbulence subsided, but the mood in the cabin did not lighten. Everyone could feel that this was just a brief calm before the next storm. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. If Priscilla continued this charade, Eleanor would have to escalate. She hated the thought of humiliating someone in front of passengers, but enough was enough. True to form, as soon as the turbulence stopped, Priscilla returned, seemingly determined to oust Eleanor from first class. This time, her voice carried a sharper edge of authority, practically reverberating throughout the cabin. "Ms. Vance, please note that our records indicate you did not purchase a first-class ticket. We've had issues with passengers upgrading themselves illegally. You cannot remain in this seat." The incredulity of her statement left Eleanor momentarily speechless. It wasn't just that Priscilla was accusing Eleanor of lying. She was accusing her of fraud. Priscilla's posture radiated an unyielding resolve, which only fueled the tension. "That's enough," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice from quavering with anger. She reached into her blazer pocket and withdrew a slim black case. Before opening it, she glanced around at the now silent cabin. Dozens of eyes were upon her, waiting. "I tried to handle this matter amicably. Since you refused to accept my valid boarding pass, let me show you another form of identification." Priscilla's eyes flared with challenge. "Another form of identification? That won't change the seat you purchased, ma'am." Without another word, Eleanor flipped open the case and revealed her official FAA director badge. The golden emblem gleamed under the overhead lights, flanked by her credentials. Gasps rippled through the row of onlookers. In that electrically charged moment, it felt as though even the engines hushed to witness the confrontation. Priscilla's eyes widened, her haughty demeanor giving way to sudden shock. Her mouth formed a silent, "Oh," and the color seemed to drain from her face. The flight attendant had clearly not anticipated that the woman she was harassing might be someone with the authority to influence airline operations, perhaps even her own career. Eleanor held the badge at eye level, the small plastic photo ID featuring her name and title beneath the Federal Aviation Administration seal. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said in a measured tone. "I am a director at the FAA. If you'd bothered to check your passenger list properly, you would have seen that I purchased this first-class ticket weeks ago." A collective ripple of astonishment traveled through the passengers. Barbara, who had been ready to leap to Eleanor's defense, now had a hand over her mouth. The tech entrepreneur behind Eleanor murmured, "Whoa," clearly transfixed. Priscilla's voice trembled. "Ms. Vance, there must be a mistake in the system. I apologize." "Yes," Eleanor replied curtly. "You should apologize. But more importantly, you need to correct your behavior right now. I am a passenger, and you have no right to treat me, or anyone else for that matter, with such disrespect." Priscilla took a half step backward, visibly rattled. She had overstepped in a big way, and now she had to face the consequences. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The low hum of the plane's engines and the whoosh of the air system provided the only background noise in the stunned cabin. Priscilla, mouth agape, seemed at a loss for how to proceed. Her gaze bounced between Eleanor's badge and the eyes of the many passengers witnessing this spectacle. Then, as though jolted by an internal command, Priscilla retreated, stammering, I need to speak with the captain." She turned on her heel and hurried down the aisle. A wave of hushed chatter erupted among the passengers. Barbara was the first to break the near silence, leaning over and whispering urgently, "Are you all right, dear?" That was unbelievable. Eleanor forced a half smile, a mix of relief and lingering anger swirling inside her. "I'm fine," she assured Barbara. "Thank you for speaking up." From the row behind, the tech entrepreneur leaned forward. "That was some serious drama," he murmured. "I've never seen a flight attendant behave like that. She must be in serious trouble now." Eleanor nodded, her eyes tracking Priscilla's path as she disappeared behind the curtain leading to the cockpit. She could only imagine the conversation happening up there. As an FAA director, Eleanor had the authority to file official complaints that could spark investigations and disciplinary action. The question now was, how would this airline handle a flight attendant who not only harassed a paying passenger, but also went so far as to accuse her of theft? 10 tense minutes crawled by. Lila approached Eleanor timidly, offering a glass of water and a damp towel, long overdue amenities for a first-class passenger. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes brimming with sincerity. "I didn't know. I didn't realize what was going on." Eleanor graciously accepted the water and nodded. "It's okay, Lila. It's not your fault." She was keenly aware that Priscilla's behavior didn't necessarily represent the entire crew. Still, the ordeal had left a bitter taste in her mouth. She sipped her water and closed her eyes, breathing slowly to calm her racing heart. Not long after, the captain's voice came over the intercom, sounding measured but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Davies speaking. We've been made aware of a situation in the first-class cabin. I want to assure you that passenger safety and comfort are our top priorities. Please continue to remain seated with your seat belts fastened while we address this matter. Thank you." Eleanor wasn't sure if she felt relief or apprehension at the announcement. The captain was now fully informed. That meant some resolution was in the works, but what would it look like? Would Priscilla be removed from her duties for the remainder of the flight? Would an apology suffice for the humiliation and stress Eleanor had endured? Eventually, Priscilla reappeared. Her shoulders sagged slightly as though the reality of her predicament had fully sunk in. She approached Eleanor's seat, mustering what seemed to be an attempt at composure. "Ms. Vance," she began quietly, "I'd like to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. The system showed an error, and I misunderstood the situation." The words were rushed, lacking conviction. Eleanor looked at Priscilla, noting the flight attendant's downcast gaze. "I accept your apology," she replied evenly. "But I must say, your behavior was unprofessional and discriminatory. I showed you my valid boarding pass multiple times, yet you chose not to believe me. You singled me out in front of the entire cabin with no concrete proof that my seat was invalid." Priscilla's cheeks flushed. She mumbled something about airline policy and system glitches, but even she didn't sound convinced. The older couple, Barbara and her husband, observed the scene from across the aisle, frowning disapprovingly at Priscilla's meager attempt at contrition. The tension lingered as Priscilla bowed slightly and withdrew, leaving Eleanor to wonder just how far her atonement would go. On one hand, Eleanor's sense of justice demanded more than a vague apology. On the other hand, a part of her wanted to move on, to not let this ugly episode consume her entire flight. As time ticked on, Eleanor considered her options. The federal aviation regulations included provisions for passenger rights and laid out protocols for flight crew conduct. While flight attendants held significant authority, they also had a responsibility to treat passengers with fairness and respect. Priscilla's actions had clearly breached those responsibilities. However, Eleanor also recognized that mistakes, albeit serious ones, could occur. She'd have to balance her moral responsibility to address discrimination with her desire not to destroy Priscilla's career without further context. Could it be that Priscilla was stressed, overworked, or had personal prejudices triggered by unconscious bias? None of those excuses would justify her behavior, but they could be relevant to how disciplinary measures might be applied. Grateful for the seat's reclining comfort, Eleanor closed her eyes for a few minutes, trying to reclaim her peace. She was scheduled to speak at a major aviation conference in Los Angeles the next day. The event would be attended by multiple airline executives and key figures from the FAA. If she reported this incident, it would undoubtedly become a hot topic among her professional network and possibly even the media. Was that the outcome she desired? Even so, she couldn't ignore the moral imperative. This wasn't just about her personal comfort. It was about preventing such treatment from happening to others in the future. With the plane cruising steadily above the clouds, Eleanor resolved to handle the matter in a way that combined fairness with firm accountability. After Priscilla's half-hearted apology, the first-class cabin settled into an uneasy calm. The usual hum of cabin life resumed, passengers reading, dozing, or watching the in-flight entertainment. Barbara and her husband exchanged quiet conversation, occasionally glancing sympathetically at Eleanor. Lila returned with the meal service, this time ensuring that Eleanor was served promptly and courteously. Priscilla, for her part, remained mostly out of sight, occasionally passing through the aisle with a forced smile but avoiding direct eye contact with Eleanor. The flight continued in this subdued fashion for another hour. Eleanor found a sense of solace in the anonymity of the moment. No more stares, no more confrontations. She sipped her coffee and tried to focus on a stack of regulatory papers she'd planned to review. Yet every so often, the tension in her shoulders returned. The knowledge that she'd have to follow up on this incident weighed heavily on her. She didn't relish punishing someone, but the incident was too serious to sweep under the rug. She thought about her countless colleagues in the FAA, particularly the ones responsible for ensuring flight attendants receive proper training, not just in safety procedures, but also in bias awareness and passenger relations. The irony was inescapable. Eleanor was at the forefront of advocating for better flight regulations, and now she'd become a victim of the very system she helped regulate. She made a silent vow. If her presence in that seat could spark change, no matter how uncomfortable it felt, she'd follow through. Sometime after the meal service, Eleanor drifted into a light sleep. Her subconscious wrestled with the turmoil of the day, conjuring fragmented dreams of boarded gates, uniformed flight attendants, and swirling clouds. When she awoke, she felt the plane descending slightly, and a quick glance at her watch told her they were about 90 minutes out from Los Angeles. She clicked on the overhead reading light and pulled out her notebook, jotting down the key points of the incident. The time she boarded, Priscilla's repeated demands, and the witness statements from Barbara and her husband, not to mention the silent witnesses in the cabin. Documentation was second nature to Eleanor in her line of work. A well-organized report often spelled the difference between swift justice and bureaucratic quagmire. The cabin was quieter now. Some passengers were still napping. Others were finishing their in-flight entertainment. Over the top of her notebook, Eleanor noticed Priscilla standing near the forward galley, carefully refilling coffee pots. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and Eleanor detected a complicated mixture of shame and resentment behind Priscilla's guarded expression. Eleanor wondered if Priscilla had fully grasped the possible ramifications of her actions, or if she was just counting the minutes until the flight ended, hoping to escape further fallout. About an hour before landing, Lila returned to Eleanor's seat one more time. She held a tray with a freshly brewed cup of tea, setting it down gently on Eleanor's tray table. "Ms. Vance," Lila said softly, "this is on the house. I thought you might like something calming before we land." Eleanor offered a grateful nod. "Thank you, Lila. I appreciate it." Lila hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I just want you to know, not all of us think or act like Priscilla. She's been under a lot of stress lately, but that doesn't excuse her behavior. I'm truly sorry you had to go through this." Eleanor offered a small, genuine smile. "Your kindness means a lot. Thank you for acknowledging it." She sipped the tea, finding it soothing. This thoughtful gesture was a stark contrast to the hostility she'd faced earlier. It reminded her that while systems might sometimes fail, individual acts of empathy could help mend them. As Lila walked away, Eleanor settled back into her seat, letting the warmth of the tea ease the tension in her shoulders. She mentally composed the steps she would take upon landing: speak with the airline's ground staff, file the necessary report, and follow through to ensure proper accountability. She owed it to herself and to future passengers who could face similar prejudice. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, announcing their initial descent into Los Angeles. Window shades were lifted, revealing the sprawling city lights dotting the horizon in the late afternoon sun. People stirred awake, returning seats to their upright positions, stowing away laptops and other devices. Priscilla appeared once more, this time walking down the aisle to ensure all carry-on items were properly stowed. When she reached Eleanor's row, she paused, cleared her throat, and spoke quietly so only Eleanor could hear. "Ms. Vance, once again I apologize. I hope we can put this behind us." Eleanor studied Priscilla's face. The flight attendant's tone was subdued, not exactly humble, but devoid of the previous hostility. It was difficult to discern whether her change in demeanor stemmed from genuine remorse or fear of retribution. "I appreciate the apology," Eleanor replied, "but I will be filing a report. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else experiences what I did." Priscilla gave a small nod, appearing to accept the inevitable. Her eyes flickered with something akin to regret before she resumed her duties. Eleanor exhaled a long breath, turning to look out the window as the plane continued its steady descent toward the City of Angels. The touchdown at Los Angeles International Airport was surprisingly smooth, a gentle bump that barely rattled the overhead bins. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken, knowing the real confrontation wasn't over. It had simply shifted to the ground. When the seatbelt sign finally pinged off, passengers began gathering their belongings. Many cast curious glances toward Eleanor, silently acknowledging the earlier drama. Barbara and her husband paused at Eleanor's row to express their sympathies. The tech entrepreneur behind them gave Eleanor a thumbs up, a small gesture of solidarity. Priscilla busied herself with opening overhead compartments. She avoided Eleanor's gaze, though Eleanor could sense her tension from a mere few feet away. Lila, on the other hand, gave Eleanor a supportive smile and a quick, "Take care," before continuing with her tasks. As the line of passengers filtered out of the aircraft, Eleanor stayed back, intending to speak with someone in authority. She could feel a knot in her stomach, a swirl of anticipation, anger, and uncertainty. Despite her professional composure, the personal indignity she'd suffered weighed on her. She reminded herself that she wasn't just any passenger. She was an FAA director with a responsibility to ensure such situations were not repeated. That knowledge propelled her forward toward the next stage of resolution. Once Eleanor stepped through the jet bridge, she was greeted by a gate agent who recognized her name, no doubt briefed by the captain or another crew member during the flight. "Ms. Vance. I'm Brenda, the on-duty supervisor. If you have a moment, we'd like to speak with you about your experience on board." Eleanor nodded, relieved that someone had been appointed to handle the incident. Brenda led her to a small seating area near the gate, away from the bustling crowd of arriving passengers. They sat down across from each other, and Brenda folded her hands, looking genuinely contrite. "First, I want to apologize on behalf of the airline," Brenda began, her voice calm but earnest. "We've been informed about what happened in first class, and we take this situation very seriously. Our goal is to make sure every passenger feels respected and safe." Eleanor appreciated the directness. "Thank you for addressing this quickly," she replied. She took out her notebook, glancing over the bullet points she'd jotted down. "I have documented everything. I am prepared to file an official complaint with both the airline and the FAA." Brenda nodded. "We understand. Please rest assured, we'll cooperate fully. We'd like to conduct an internal review of Ms. Hayes's conduct and cross-check the passenger manifest to see where the error originated." Eleanor took a measured breath, feeling a slight wave of relief that the airline seemed willing to handle this matter appropriately. But she also knew that promises were easy to make. It was follow-through that truly mattered. Brenda offered Eleanor a formal complaint form, which Eleanor filled out meticulously, detailing every instance of Priscilla's hostile and discriminatory actions. She provided the names of witnesses who might corroborate her account: Barbara, her husband, possibly the tech entrepreneur. She also included Lila's name, noting her polite and professional conduct in contrast to Priscilla's. As Eleanor wrote down the final sentences, she felt a heavy but necessary sense of responsibility. She knew that her position at the FAA might add weight to this complaint, yet she also believed that any passenger, regardless of status, deserved fair treatment. She handed the completed form back to Brenda. Ms. Vance, we'll investigate this thoroughly, Brenda reiterated. We might need to contact you for additional information. In the meantime, if there's anything we can do, refunds, future flight credits, please let me know. Eleanor paused, then shook her head slightly. I'm not interested in freebies, Brenda. What I want is a clear message sent to your staff that prejudice, whether conscious or unconscious, is unacceptable. If Ms. Hayes did this to me, she could do it to someone else. That's what needs to change. Brenda nodded solemnly, her eyes reflecting respect for Eleanor's stance. Understood, Ms. Vance. We'll make sure your concerns are taken seriously. Before Eleanor left the gate area, she noticed Priscilla standing off to one side, talking quietly with another airline employee, likely another supervisor. Priscilla's usually confident posture had deflated, her shoulders drooped, and she stared at the floor. Part of Eleanor felt a twinge of compassion. She never relished someone else's downfall, even if it was self-inflicted. Yet the memory of Priscilla's accusatory glare and dismissive treatment was too fresh to evoke much sympathy. With the complaint form filed, Eleanor made her way through LAX toward the rideshare pickup area. Her phone buzzed with messages, colleagues asking if she'd arrived safely, a friend reminding her of dinner plans, and an FAA associate confirming the time of her conference appearance the next day. She replied with generic affirmations, not yet ready to unpack the ordeal she'd just experienced. By the time she slipped into the back of a black sedan heading toward her hotel, Eleanor felt the weariness of the day settle over her like a blanket. She rested her head against the seat, gazing out at the sun-soaked palm trees of Los Angeles. The city's carefree facade was a stark contrast to the tension she'd just endured. Still, she felt a firm resolve crystallize in her mind. This wouldn't just be a blip in her memory. She intended to follow through until she was sure meaningful action had been taken. That evening, after checking into her hotel and freshening up, Eleanor discovered that the tech entrepreneur from the flight had posted a thread on social media recounting the entire incident in vivid detail. Without naming Eleanor, but describing her as a high-level FAA official, the post had garnered thousands of likes, shares, and outraged comments in just a few hours. Some commenters speculated about the identity of the wronged passenger. Others lambasted the airline for racial discrimination. Eleanor scrolled through the messages, feeling a mixture of dismay and validation. She hadn't wanted the incident to become a viral spectacle, but she also recognized that public scrutiny could compel the airline to act decisively. She typed a brief note to her media relations colleague at the FAA, alerting them to the situation, then set her phone aside. The next morning, she awoke to find multiple missed calls from unknown numbers, journalists no doubt trying to confirm the identity of the person in the viral post. Eleanor sighed, making a mental note to prepare a measured statement if the situation escalated. For now, she had to focus on her scheduled presentation at the aviation conference, a chance to discuss critical regulatory updates with industry leaders. As she buttoned her blazer and reviewed her notes, Eleanor couldn't help but reflect on the surreal irony. She would stand in front of an audience to champion fair and safe aviation practices, all while recovering from an ordeal that underscored why such practices were urgently needed, not just at the corporate level, but at the human level. The aviation conference took place at a sprawling convention center bustling with people from every corner of the industry: pilots, engineers, airline executives, regulators, and media personnel. Eleanor's keynote address was scheduled for late morning. She arrived early, hoping for a quiet moment to prepare. As she made her way through the corridors, a tall man in a crisp suit approached her. Ms. Vance, I'm Arthur Davis from Delta Airlines, he said, extending his hand. I heard about the incident on your flight. I want to personally apologize and let you know we're launching a full investigation. Eleanor, taken aback by his directness, shook his hand. She recognized Arthur Davis's name. He was a high-ranking official at Delta. Thank you, she replied, though I wish it hadn't come to this. Arthur looked genuinely contrite. We're dedicated to making sure everyone is treated with respect. We'll be reviewing our training protocols to ensure incidents like this don't happen again. I'm sorry you were subjected to such treatment. Eleanor nodded, gratitude flickering inside her. His words felt sincere, and it was a relief to know that the higher-ups were taking note. While it didn't erase what happened, it reinforced the idea that progress could emerge from conflict. A short while later, Eleanor stood at the podium, addressing a sizable audience. The room was lined with exhibitor booths displaying the latest aerospace innovations, but all eyes were on her as she spoke about new FAA directives aimed at improving passenger safety and reducing mid-air incidents. Aviation isn't just about mechanics and regulations, she said, her voice resonating through the hall. It's about people, passengers, crew, and every individual who places their trust in the skies. When we talk about safety, we must include emotional and psychological safety, not just the physical kind. Discrimination has no place in any airline's operations. She paused, letting her words sink in. She didn't explicitly recount her personal experience from the day before, but the subtle hints were clear. Her speech drew murmurs of agreement, and she saw a few nods from the audience. By the time she concluded, the applause was thunderous. As she stepped off the stage, a wave of relief washed over her. She had used her platform to quietly address the undercurrent of discrimination without turning her speech into a personal grievance. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages, colleagues praising her talk, fellow regulators requesting to meet, and a smattering of reporters hoping for a comment on the viral social media post. Later that afternoon, Eleanor received a phone call from the airline's corporate office. She found a quiet corner of the convention center to take the call. The representative on the other end identified himself as a high-ranking customer relations executive. Ms. Vance, we'd like to invite you to a meeting with our senior management team, he said. We're considering new inclusivity training programs for our flight crews, and we'd value your input. We understand you have unique expertise and insights. Eleanor felt a surge of hope. That sounds promising, she replied. I'd be happy to consult, especially if it leads to tangible improvements. The executive continued, regarding Ms. Hayes, we've spoken with her and have placed her on temporary administrative leave pending a full review. She may face disciplinary actions, but we're also exploring a restorative approach. We believe in giving employees a chance to learn from their mistakes, provided they truly understand and regret the harm caused. A wave of relief coursed through Eleanor. She had no desire to see someone's life destroyed, but she did want real accountability and growth. I'd like to be updated on that process, Eleanor insisted, and I want to be sure other staff members also benefit from comprehensive training. This isn't just about one person. It's about the system that allowed this to happen. We absolutely agree, said the executive. We'll keep you in the loop. In the following weeks, Eleanor found herself both exhausted and gratified. The airline followed through on its promise to investigate thoroughly. She was invited to video conferences where senior airline leadership, as well as civil rights advocates, discussed how to incorporate bias training and stricter disciplinary guidelines into standard protocols. Eleanor used her expertise not only as an FAA official, but also as someone who had personally encountered discrimination in the skies. Meanwhile, a formal statement of apology was sent to Eleanor, along with a broader memorandum sent to employees and posted publicly. It detailed the airline's commitment to preventing discrimination and outlined specific steps they intended to take, such as mandatory cultural sensitivity training, improved passenger manifest checks, and clearer protocols for verifying seating issues without confrontation or bias. Eleanor also learned that Priscilla had taken responsibility for her actions. In a letter, Priscilla admitted that her behavior was fueled by unfounded assumptions and stress. She expressed remorse and her intention to undergo whatever training was necessary to correct her perspective. Eleanor, for her part, felt a tentative sense of closure. If genuine self-reflection could occur, perhaps others wouldn't have to endure what she did. It was a complicated journey, riddled with anger, frustration, and discomfort, but in the end, it served as a catalyst for a far-reaching discussion on fairness and respect in air travel. Eleanor was satisfied that this chapter had concluded not only with accountability, but also with a real chance for change. There you have it, a single flight that descended into chaos, prejudice, and humiliation, only to transform into a teachable moment with ripple effects far beyond one cabin. Eleanor Vance stood her ground, flashing her FAA director badge at precisely the right time, proving that you never truly know who's sitting next to you or what they stand for. The turbulence she faced wasn't just in the air. It was embedded in a system that occasionally falters and must be held accountable. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred your emotions, made you reflect on your own experiences, or fueled your desire for change? Please like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that spotlight injustice and celebrate those who dare to challenge it. Let's keep the conversation alive and strive for skies and a world where everyone is treated with dignity.